FBI agent vanished in 1987. 4 years later, a storage unit reveals this. It was a cool, quiet morning in the fall of 1987 when FBI agent John Williams went missing. He had always been reliable and dedicated, a man known for his calm demeanor and sharp mind. Those who worked with him respected him, and his family adored him. John wasn't just a man of law, he was also a loving husband to his wife, Mary, and a father to 2 young children. His life seemed perfect, the American dream playing out in real time. John had been with the FBI for over a decade, working on high-profile cases, including those involving organized crime. He was often seen as the one who could solve cases that others deemed unsolvable. His colleagues at the FBI trusted him, and his success rate spoke for itself. In fact, it wasn't unusual for John to stay late, especially when he was deep into a case. He believed that every piece of evidence mattered, and he was determined to make sure he never missed a detail. But then, one day, John simply vanished. It was as if the world swallowed him whole. The last person to see him was his assistant, a young agent named Laura. She had left the office early that evening, and John had stayed behind, working on some last-minute reports. The next morning, when the office reopened, John was nowhere to be found. His car was still parked in its usual spot, but there was no sign of him anywhere. His desk was tidy, his files in order, and his coffee mug sat untouched on the edge of his desk. At first, no one thought much of it. Maybe he had taken an unplanned leave or gone to visit a family member. But as the hours ticked by, concern began to grow. By noon, John's wife, Mary, was calling the office, asking if anyone had seen him. No one had. By evening, the FBI had launched a search. His co-workers began checking his apartment, speaking with his neighbors, and reviewing his recent cases, hoping to find some clue, any clue, that would explain his sudden disappearance. The initial response from law enforcement was cautious, but as the days passed with no sign of John, panic began to set in. It was highly unusual for an FBI agent to just vanish without a trace. John had always been careful, and he was a man of principle. He would never leave his family or the bureau without notifying someone. Was it foul play? Did something happen during one of his cases that had led to his disappearance? Or had something else happened, something no one had expected? As the investigation into John's disappearance progressed, theories began to emerge. Some of his colleagues suspected that he might have been kidnapped. After all, John had been working on several dangerous cases involving organized crime. Was it possible that someone had taken him as a warning or to stop him from investigating further? Others began to wonder if he might have run off, though that theory seemed almost impossible to believe. John was not the type of person to just disappear, especially without any explanation. Mary, meanwhile, struggled to hold it together. She spent hours talking to the police, retracing John's steps, and hoping for a breakthrough. Her mind kept racing through every possible scenario, but none of them seemed to make sense. John had been in a good place in life. He was close to his family, his colleagues, and his friends. There was no indication that he was unhappy or had any reason to leave. It just didn't make sense. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation seemed to stall. Despite numerous tips and reports, none of them led anywhere. A few people claimed to have seen John in various parts of the city, but those leads were always false. As time went on, the case grew colder, and the media began to lose interest. What had started as a high-profile disappearance slowly became just another unsolved mystery. Mary was devastated. The emotional toll of not knowing what had happened to her husband was unbearable. Every night, she would sit by the phone, hoping for a call, but the silence was deafening. She clung to the belief that somehow, somewhere, John would come home. But as months went by, that hope began to fade. In the FBI, there was a quiet sense of guilt. John's colleagues couldn't shake the feeling that they should have done more, that they should have found him sooner. They began questioning their own investigation, wondering if they had missed something along the way. After all, they knew John better than anyone. If something had happened to him, it would have been hard for any of them to understand why. The case reached a point where it was almost forgotten, filed away like so many others before it. The years passed, and life moved on. But for Mary and their children, the pain never stopped. The unanswered questions continued to haunt her. Where was John? Had he really been kidnapped, or had something more sinister occurred? The lack of closure was perhaps the hardest thing to bear. Then, 4 years later, something happened that no one could have predicted. It wasn't until 1991 that the first real breakthrough came, and it came from the most unexpected source: a storage unit. The revelation would send shockwaves through the investigation and would eventually change everything. But until that moment, no one had a clue what had happened to John Williams. The case remained a cold mystery, but the story was far from over. Years passed, and the mystery surrounding FBI agent John Williams's disappearance slowly faded from the headlines. The case had become one of those stories that people talked about briefly but soon forgot, and for the Williams family, every day without answers felt like an eternity. Mary, John's wife, had tried everything she could to keep the hope alive. She spoke to detectives, followed every lead, and even consulted psychics, hoping for something, anything, that could give her a hint as to where her husband was. But there were no answers. It was as if the world had swallowed him whole. For the children, the years that followed felt strange and empty. They grew up without the comforting presence of their father, and though they tried to move on, the questions about where he was and why he had disappeared lingered in the back of their minds. Their mother, though determined, had also changed. The once hopeful and strong woman had been worn down by the passage of time, her face marked by the years of unanswered questions. Still, she kept a candle burning in her heart, waiting for the day when John would come home. Meanwhile, life continued in the FBI. The case of Agent Williams was tucked away in a file cabinet somewhere, gathering dust. Every once in a while, someone would think about it, but no one felt the urgency of solving the mystery. The Bureau had moved on to other cases. New agents were assigned to different tasks, and though the case was technically still open, it had long been overshadowed by more pressing matters. The name John Williams was becoming just another forgotten entry in a list of unsolved disappearances. But everything changed on a cold winter morning in January 1991, when an old storage unit in a run-down part of town was opened, and the contents inside were examined. The storage facility was a small, nondescript building that most people never noticed. It was the kind of place that people rented for storing old furniture, personal items, or forgotten family heirlooms. Its halls were lined with dusty boxes and furniture that had long been abandoned by their owners. But in one particular unit, the contents weren't what anyone had expected. The unit in question had been rented by someone who hadn't paid the rent in months, and after the standard procedure of auctioning off unclaimed units, the items inside were set to be sold to the highest bidder. A local man had purchased the contents, curious about what might be inside. When he opened the door to the storage unit, he had no idea that his life was about to change forever. The man, whose name was Tom, began to sift through the piles of old belongings. There were books, some old clothes, and a few boxes that had been hastily packed. But among the usual items was something that caught his eye: a file box, the kind used by office workers to store important papers. As Tom opened the box, his heart raced. Inside were papers with the FBI logo on them, marked with John Williams's name. Tom froze for a moment, unsure of what to do next. He wasn't sure why these documents were in a storage unit, but his gut told him that something wasn't right. Tom immediately contacted the storage facility owner, who in turn called the police. When the authorities arrived, they carefully examined the documents and confirmed that they were indeed connected to the missing FBI agent. But that wasn't all. There were also personal belongings, a bag, some clothing, and even a small amount of cash. The strangest part, however, was a set of photographs, each one featuring John Williams standing next to various people, some familiar, others unfamiliar. In the corner of one photo was a familiar face, a man who had been linked to organized crime cases that John had investigated before he disappeared. The discovery set off a chain reaction. The FBI, once disinterested in the case, immediately reopened the investigation with renewed energy. A team of agents was assigned to the case, and they began to investigate how these items had ended up in a storage unit. Who had rented the unit? And why had these things been hidden away for so long? These questions haunted everyone involved in the case. The new lead had rekindled hope that the mystery of John Williams's disappearance could finally be solved. The storage unit's contents weren't just a random collection of old belongings. They seemed to tell a story, though it was a story that no one had been able to fully piece together. Was John involved in something larger than anyone had imagined? Was there a deeper conspiracy at play, or had he been hiding something from his colleagues? What did these photographs mean, and why were they hidden in a place like this? It was as if John had been preparing for something or had been forced into hiding. As the investigation continued, new information came to light. The storage unit had been rented under a fake name, and the payment for the unit had been made in cash. There were no records of who had rented it or why. The agents began to follow a trail of receipts and rental records, but it seemed as though every lead they followed only led to more questions. Whoever had hidden these items knew what they were doing. They were trying to keep something secret, and they had gone to great lengths to ensure that no one would find out. Meanwhile, Mary, John's wife, was informed of the discovery. She was both relieved and horrified. Finally, after 4 long years, there was a breakthrough. But what did it mean? Had John staged his own disappearance, or had he been forced into hiding by someone who wanted him to stay silent? Her mind raced with questions, but she knew one thing for certain: whatever had happened, it had to be connected to the dangerous cases John had worked on before his disappearance. In the days that followed, the FBI worked around the clock to trace every lead and piece together the puzzle. But each new discovery only deepened the mystery. There were still so many unanswered questions, and the truth seemed just out of reach. The Williams family had been living in limbo for so long, and now, with the reopening of the case, the truth seemed more distant than ever. But they were determined to find out what happened to John, no matter what it took. For the agents involved in the case, this was more than just another missing persons investigation. It was a personal matter. They had known John, worked with him, and respected him. They were now determined to find him, whether he was alive or dead, and uncover the truth behind his mysterious disappearance. As the days turned into weeks, the FBI's investigation continued to uncover more pieces of the puzzle. But there was one thing they all knew for sure: John Williams's disappearance was not just another unsolved case. It was a story of intrigue, danger, and betrayal, one that would take them deep into a world of secrets and lies. The discovery of the storage unit and its strange contents brought a renewed sense of urgency to the investigation. The FBI had been shaken from its complacency, and agents began working day and night to piece together the mystery surrounding John Williams's disappearance. The case had now gone from a missing persons investigation to something much more complicated. What had started as a personal tragedy for one family was now a matter of national concern. John's wife, Mary, was both relieved and filled with dread when she was notified about the breakthrough. The idea that there was finally a lead made her feel hopeful, but at the same time, she couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. What had her husband been involved in? What kind of secret life could he have been hiding? She tried to imagine a scenario where John had staged his disappearance on his own terms, but nothing about his life had pointed in that direction. He had always been a devoted family man, someone who would never abandon them without a word. Still, the evidence from the storage unit was hard to ignore. The documents, the photographs, and even the clothing all pointed to the possibility that John had been living under a different identity. But why? And who was behind it? As the FBI sifted through the contents of the storage unit, they discovered more startling revelations. The photographs of John had been taken at various locations, some familiar, but others completely unknown. In one of the pictures, he was standing next to a well-known figure from the world of organized crime, a man whose name had appeared in some of John's old case files. The criminal, who had been a suspect in multiple high-profile cases, had connections to people who operated in the shadows, beyond the reach of the law. The fact that John had been photographed with this individual was a shocking discovery. Was it possible that John had been working undercover on a case that no one had known about? Had he been infiltrating dangerous criminal organizations, gathering information that could bring down a major syndicate? If so, why had he disappeared? And why had he left all of this behind, hidden in a storage unit? The agents working the case began to dig deeper into John's past. They reviewed his recent assignments and the cases he had been working on before his disappearance. The more they looked, the more it seemed like John had been involved in something far more dangerous than anyone had realized. His investigation into organized crime had taken him deep into a web of corruption, violence, and deceit. And it was clear that someone or something had forced him to hide. The FBI agents found that John had been in contact with several key informants in the months leading up to his disappearance. They had uncovered a pattern of meetings and phone calls with people who were linked to underground networks. Some of these contacts had been involved in arms smuggling, while others had ties to drug trafficking. John had been gathering intelligence on these operations, but it appeared that someone had caught on to his investigation. This new information led the FBI to a troubling conclusion. Had John been discovered? Had he been silenced by the very people he had been trying to expose? The theory that John had been forced into hiding, or worse, was beginning to seem more plausible. But no one knew for sure. The trail had gone cold after his disappearance, and despite the new leads, there was still no solid evidence to explain where he had gone or what had happened to him. The investigation into John's disappearance was becoming more complex by the day. The agents now had to deal with the possibility that someone within the Bureau itself might have been involved in his disappearance. Was there a mole, someone who had leaked information about John's investigation to the criminals he was targeting? Had John been betrayed by someone he trusted? These were questions that hung over the investigation like a dark cloud. In the weeks that followed, the FBI tried to track down every lead, but it felt like they were chasing ghosts. The contacts John had been meeting with had vanished, and no one seemed to know anything about the people in the photographs. It was as though they were all part of an invisible network that was deliberately staying hidden. And the more the FBI dug, the more it seemed like John had been just one small piece of a much larger puzzle. Mary, though grateful for the renewed investigation, was still haunted by the thought that her husband might have been caught in something so dangerous that it had forced him to disappear. She started to piece together her own memories of John, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had she missed any clues? Had there been signs that he was involved in something risky? Mary's mind raced through every conversation they'd ever had, looking for answers that had eluded her for so long. But there was nothing. Everything had seemed normal. As the FBI continued its investigation, the pressure to solve the case grew. The public, once captivated by the story of the missing FBI agent, had now moved on. The media coverage had died down, and people began to forget about John Williams. But the agents working the case could not forget. They were determined to uncover the truth, no matter how long it took. The investigation reached a turning point when a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of John's old informants, a man who had been involved in the criminal underworld, came forward with new information. He claimed that John had been in danger long before he disappeared. According to the informant, John had been gathering information on a powerful criminal syndicate that was operating across several states. But something had gone wrong. The informant didn't know the full details, but he hinted that John had been close to exposing a major conspiracy involving corrupt law enforcement officers. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but there were still many unanswered questions. What had John discovered? And why had he been left to disappear without a trace? These were questions that no one could yet answer, but the agents were closing in on the truth. They knew they were getting closer, but they also knew that the answers might be far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The investigation was far from over, and with each new lead, the mystery deepened. As the days passed, the FBI's investigation into John's disappearance grew more intense. They were no longer just searching for a missing agent. They were searching for the truth that had been hidden for far too long. The deeper they dug, the more it seemed like the case of John Williams was part of a much larger story, a story that involved secrets, betrayal, and a dangerous world that no one could fully understand. The investigation into the disappearance of FBI agent John Williams had taken on a new life, but with it came a growing sense of unease. After weeks of chasing leads, interviewing witnesses, and analyzing the items found in the storage unit, the FBI was slowly starting to unravel the truth. Yet, with every new discovery, the mystery seemed only to deepen. It was clear that John had been involved in something far larger and more dangerous than anyone had imagined. But the question remained, what had happened to him, and who was behind it? The breakthrough had come when one of John's old informants, a man known only by his street name, Eagle, had come forward with information that was both valuable and terrifying. Eagle had been one of John's primary sources during his undercover work in the world of organized crime. He was a man who had seen it all, and yet he had never fully trusted the system. But the moment he heard that John had gone missing, something inside him snapped. He couldn't stay quiet any longer. Eagle had been through enough close calls with the law and criminals alike, and he knew that John's disappearance wasn't a random act. It was a message. According to Eagle, John had been closing in on a criminal syndicate that operated across state lines. The syndicate was vast, and it was rumored to have ties to powerful figures in both business and government. What was even more troubling, though, was that John had discovered something that could expose them all. Something so big that it had sent shockwaves through the organization when they realized John was getting too close. Eagle explained that John had been tipped off to a massive conspiracy involving not just criminals, but corrupt law enforcement officers as well. For years, these officers had been turning a blind eye to the syndicate's activities, allowing the criminal organization to thrive unchecked. John's investigation had uncovered evidence of money laundering, human trafficking, and illegal arms deals, all linked to people in positions of power. And if that wasn't enough, there were whispers that some of these officers had been working directly with the syndicate, providing them with intelligence and protection in exchange for a share of the profits. This information sent a chill through the FBI agents working on the case. The idea that someone within their own ranks could be involved in such a web of corruption was deeply unsettling. But the more they dug into Eagle's story, the more it seemed to line up with what they had already discovered. John had been investigating the syndicate for months, slowly piecing together a damning case. But what had happened to him? Why had he disappeared when he was so close to exposing everything? The investigators knew that they had to act fast. If John had indeed uncovered something this significant, it was likely that those responsible were already trying to cover their tracks. They had to find him alive or dead before the truth was buried forever. With this new information, the FBI took another hard look at the photos from the storage unit. One of the photos showed John standing with a man who was known to be a middleman for the syndicate, a man with deep ties to both the criminal underworld and corrupt law enforcement. This individual had been on the radar of federal agents for years, but they had never been able to bring him down. John had been the one person who was close to making it happen. But now, with his disappearance, it seemed like the syndicate had won for the time being, at least. The team began reaching out to contacts who might be able to help them get closer to the truth. They spoke with informants who had once worked with John and others who had crossed paths with him during his investigations. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but it was clear that the road ahead would be filled with obstacles. There were powerful forces at work here, and they would stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden. As the weeks passed, new details emerged. The FBI learned that John had been planning to meet with another informant just days before he disappeared. This meeting, they believed, would have been the final piece of the puzzle. But for some reason, it had never happened. The informant had gone dark, and no one could reach him. The authorities tried everything they could to track him down, but he had seemingly vanished off the face of the earth. The more they investigated, the more it seemed like someone was always one step ahead of them, carefully covering their tracks and erasing any evidence that could lead them to the truth. It wasn't until a few months later that the FBI finally got a break. A former member of the syndicate, someone who had been working as a low-level enforcer, was arrested in a completely unrelated case. Under pressure from law enforcement, he cracked. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he began to cooperate, providing the authorities with information about the syndicate's operations and the people who had been involved in John's disappearance. This man, whose name was Frank, had worked closely with several of the key figures in the syndicate. He told the FBI that John had been getting too close to exposing their operations, and they had been forced to act. According to Frank, John had been kidnapped and held captive by the syndicate for weeks before he disappeared from public view. The syndicate had been trying to get him to back off from his investigation, but John refused. He was determined to see the case through, no matter the cost. Eventually, the syndicate made the decision to eliminate him. Frank didn't know the full details of what had happened to John, but he did know that he was likely dead. The information he provided was chilling. John had been taken to a remote location, where he was interrogated by some of the most ruthless members of the syndicate. They wanted to know what he had uncovered, and they were willing to go to any lengths to stop him from exposing them. Frank's testimony confirmed many of the suspicions the FBI had. It seemed that John had been a man on a mission, and the syndicate had stopped at nothing to ensure he never saw the light of day again. But even with this new information, the case remained far from solved. The FBI still didn't know exactly where John's body was or what had happened in those final moments of his life. The more they learned, the more they realized just how deep the conspiracy ran. John's investigation had been part of something much bigger than anyone had understood. And it wasn't just the criminals they had to worry about. The lines between law enforcement and the criminals they were supposed to stop had become so blurred that it was nearly impossible to tell who was working for whom. The truth was that John had been up against a force that was far more powerful and far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. As the investigation continued, the FBI was faced with a difficult choice: push forward and risk angering those in power, or walk away and allow the conspiracy to continue. But the agents who had worked with John knew that they couldn't stop now. They owed it to him, and they owed it to the people who had been hurt by the syndicate's actions. The search for the truth would not end until John's story was told, no matter the cost. The discovery of what had happened to FBI agent John Williams was both a tragic end and a haunting beginning. The FBI, after years of unanswered questions, was finally unraveling the dark and dangerous network that had taken John's life. As the case reached its final stages, the agents involved in the investigation could only look back in disbelief at how deep the conspiracy had run and how far the criminal syndicate had gone to cover up their tracks. In the days following Frank's testimony, the FBI continued to gather evidence that further confirmed the disturbing details of John's fate. They dug into every connection John had, speaking to former colleagues, informants, and anyone who might have had information about his final days. The picture that emerged was chilling. John had not been a victim of a simple kidnapping. He had been silenced by an organization that had its roots in both the criminal underworld and even some elements of law enforcement. The FBI now had undeniable proof that John had been investigating something so powerful and dangerous that it had cost him his life. But what really struck the agents was how long the conspiracy had been going on, and how many people had been involved. It wasn't just criminals that John had been working against, it was a system of corruption, a system that reached into the very institutions that were meant to protect the public. As they pieced together the puzzle, the FBI agents realized the full extent of the damage that had been done. John had been trying to expose not just a criminal syndicate but a vast network of corruption that had allowed these illegal activities to continue for years. And despite all of his efforts, he had been betrayed by those he trusted most, people in positions of authority who had used their power to shield the criminal organization from justice. For John's family, the pain of learning the truth was mixed with a strange sense of relief. They had lived for years with the nagging fear that John had simply walked away, that he had chosen to leave them behind for some unknown reason. But the truth was far more painful. John had been forced into hiding, trapped in a world of lies and betrayal, and ultimately, he had paid the ultimate price for his dedication to his work. Mary, John's wife, was left to cope with the emotional aftermath of the truth. For so long, she had wondered where her husband was and why he had disappeared. The emotional toll had been immense, but now that she knew what had happened, the sense of closure was bittersweet. She had lost her husband, but in a way, she had also gained something back, the knowledge that John had never abandoned them. He had been fighting for something bigger than himself, something that would have changed the lives of so many people. Still, the journey was far from over. As the FBI worked to dismantle the criminal network John had been trying to expose, it became clear that the fight was just beginning. The agents were now on the front lines of a battle that would require all their strength and resolve. They had uncovered a conspiracy of shocking proportions, but there were still many more questions to answer. Who else had been involved in John's death? How far did the corruption go? And most importantly, how many more lives were at risk because of the actions of a few powerful individuals? The FBI agents knew that they couldn't let John's death be in vain. They were determined to bring down the syndicate and expose the corrupt officials who had allowed it to thrive. But the more they learned, the more they realized that the fight would be long and difficult. The syndicate was entrenched, and its influence spread far and wide. But the agents were not deterred. They had a duty to carry on John's work, and they were willing to face whatever obstacles lay ahead. As they moved forward, the agents discovered more evidence linking the corrupt law enforcement officers to the syndicate. They found a trail of secret meetings, hidden financial transactions, and coded messages that had been exchanged between the criminals and those supposed to be protecting the public. It was clear that this was not just a case of rogue officers, it was a coordinated effort to protect a criminal empire that had been operating under the radar for years. The FBI began making arrests, starting with the lower-level members of the syndicate. These individuals were the ones who had been working in the shadows, handling the day-to-day operations of the organization. They were brought in for questioning, and one by one, they began to break, providing information that led to the arrest of even more powerful figures. With each new lead, the FBI moved closer to dismantling the entire network. But they knew that the real challenge lay ahead, taking down the people at the top of the organization, the ones who had the power to make everything disappear. As the investigation reached its climax, the FBI agents worked tirelessly to gather enough evidence to take down the syndicate's leaders. The pressure was immense. They knew that time was running out, and that any delay could result in the escape of the people who had been responsible for John's death. But they were determined to see it through. They knew that the truth had to come out, and that justice had to be served. The final arrest came just weeks later. The syndicate's leaders, including several high-ranking law enforcement officers, were taken into custody. It was a victory, but it came at a high cost. John Williams was gone, and the families of the people who had been affected by the syndicate's actions had been forever changed. The investigation had brought justice, but it had also revealed the extent of the corruption that had allowed this criminal network to thrive for so long. For Mary and her children, the closure was bittersweet. They had finally learned the truth about John's disappearance, but it didn't bring him back. The pain of losing him would never go away, but they found comfort in knowing that his death had not been in vain. John had given everything to bring justice to those who needed it most, and in the end, his work had made a difference. The criminal syndicate had been destroyed, and the corrupt officials who had helped them had been exposed. John Williams may have lost his life, but his legacy lived on. The investigation had not only brought down a criminal empire, but it had also revealed the importance of perseverance and integrity in the face of overwhelming odds. John had fought for what was right, and his actions had left a lasting impact on the world. His family would never forget him, and neither would the agents who had worked alongside him. As the story came to a close, the FBI had gained a new sense of purpose. They had seen firsthand how far corruption could go and how important it was to stay vigilant, no matter the cost. John's legacy would inspire future generations of agents to continue the fight for justice, ensuring that no one, no matter their power, could escape the consequences of their actions. And so, with the final pieces of the puzzle in place, the story of John Williams came to an end. But his sacrifice, and the truth he uncovered, would never be forgotten.